I think the situation is not as bad as it could have been, as it would have been, if Russia had deployed all of its skills and history of operational excellence in disinformation with the full focus. And the reason why they haven't is because they didn't plan for this war to continue for as long, and they didn't plan for a lot of the other front lines that they have to engage with, also in information warfare domestically. So I think we're seeing a sort of a maintenance level campaign of disinformation and promoting disinformation by the Russian government at the moment. And we're also seeing a sort of a successful counter disinformation, but also at times very tactical misinformation, disinformation provided by the Ukrainian side in the war, which they have the full right to in the case of a defensive war position that they're forced to be in at the moment. But what do I mean by we don't see the full potential of the Russian war machine? I mean, I've been monitoring some internal communication. I've been talking to people that are close to the disinformation machine in the Kremlin, and they are seeing a sort of a doomed scenario for themselves. They don't think that they can convince anybody who's not already pre-convinced of the righteousness of the Russian side in the war in changing their mind. What we are seeing now is, again, a level of maintenance, moderate disinformation, trying to come up with an alternative scenario for every event, notable event on the front line, mostly in order to obscure and make it more difficult for disinterested audiences in the West, in Europe, and in the United States to choose the sort of the narrative that they believe, mostly to make them tired, mostly to make them confused. And this is working in many cases. I mean, the dam explosion, in the example we're looking at today, is a good example, because the investment of mental powers in trying to take a position early on in such a case is overwhelming for the average reader and listener. And they're going to park it out for later, and later this topic will be displaced by another topic. So it will never become a clear-cut answer for a large part of the population. What they are focusing on is creating stronger disinformation narratives where people are more susceptible to that. I mean, the majority of the Western society is not susceptible to the concept of Russia waging a just war. So they're kind of giving up that narrative. They're not pushing that narrative. What they're trying to push, however, quite actively, is the narrative that it was the United States and NATO that pushed Russia into this war. It's not a just war for Russia, but neither is it without fault for the rest of the world. And this is working. This is working for a large part of the American audience, for a large part of the so-called skeptical users of media in Europe. And we see that over and over. So that is working. Another narrative that they're successfully pushing is the narrative of the Ukrainians causing trouble in Europe and wherever they end up being in large numbers. And that is also working, because these are narratives that are to which most of society is susceptible, because they don't know better and they can be influenced one way or another quite fast. On the other hand, what we do see is a lot of misinformation, not disinformation, being promoted by agents of influence in the misinformation sphere. And I would not hesitate to name somebody like Elon Musk as a very, very strong agent of misinformation. I don't think he wants to disinform. I think his mind works in a way where he likes to challenge publicly accepted concepts, and that is irresponsible in many ways, where he's putting under question mark a lot of credible and valid information. I mean, he took a direct hit at my organization, Bellingcat, by calling it a psychological operations organization. And when we try to trace down the source of such belief in his head, it is not some malign intent to damage Bellingcat. It's just that he had read a group of articles in a publication called The Gray Zone about Bellingcat. And we had found out earlier that a lot of the basic facts used in those articles had been created by artificial intelligence, by ChatGPT, in the form of fake references and fake footnotes to articles about Bellingcat. So you can see how misinformation can be just as influential or even more influential in terms of the negative effect during a time of war than active disinformation. Now, this does not mean that we are in a great space, because it just means that the main impact of disinformation is delayed. What we see is that the disinformation machine in Russia, which includes such notable examples as the GRU Special Propaganda Unit, and obviously the privatized troll farms, they're focused currently on a domestic problem. They're focused on trying to prevent and preempt the disintegration of society, of the consolidation of society around the war. And it's a finite resource. It's a limited resource that they can't stretch forever. We are being helped at the moment by the fact that Prigozhin, who was running one of the most efficient, if not the most effective, disinformation machine in Russia internationally, is not really fully motivated to be helping the current goals of the Kremlin because of his own sort of standoff with the government and the Ministry of Defense. And we benefiting from the fact that actually one of the professional players in disinformation is demotivated. And as I said, the special propaganda machine of the GRU are focused on domestic audiences at the moment. What is also helping this is the fact that Russian society is not as consolidated as it may appear to us in terms of the support for the war effort. And they have to allocate a lot more resources than previously thought. Russian society may not, in its large part, may not be open to Western narratives about what's happening on the front line, but it is equally skeptical to Kremlin narratives. And this, I've given examples at previous speeches. We've been following the most frequently asked questions on the Russian version of Google, on Yandex, over the more than a year of the war. And we see that in the top 10 of questions, it's always questions that doubt the official narratives, that are trying to find answers somewhere in the depth of the internet about things that they don't trust the government telling them the truth about, starting from what happened to the Moskva cruiser, what happened really in Bucha, ending with why is Ukraine winning in the war early on. I mean, this was a question that was one of the top 5 questions on the Russian internet within about 3 to 4 months of the start of the war. So you can see the level of unconsolidation of public opinion in Russia, level of skepticism, and this explains why so much efforts have to be paid in that direction. Last, I would mention that in some recent conversations that we've kind of been privy to, I've been privy to, it seems that the Kremlin at the top has decided to park the efforts to convert Western opinion or a large part of Western opinion in favor of understanding the Russian narrative, quote unquote, we've lost the battle now. We will wait for the West to tire from the war, and then we'll start our propaganda machine after that. So we haven't apparently seen the start of the major Russian disinformation war, which is supposed to start when the West tires of supporting Ukraine. So this is just a few words from me to explain why I think we haven't seen as professional as disinformation war from Russia as we might have. But it doesn't mean that it's not working, because even at maintenance levels, a large swathes of society are already prepared to accept the Russian or at least an anti-Ukrainian narrative. And we see different percentages per country of such swaths of the population. We see that, unfortunately, Bulgaria is a country where a large percent of the population prefers to hear a pro-Russian narrative, and anything that counters that causes cognitive dissonance. And similarly, we see even neighboring countries that one would argue should be similar in their ability to process information that is tied to ideological precepts, such as the Czech Republic and Slovakia. We see a significantly higher proclivity of Slovakian audiences to accept pro-Russian narratives than in the Czech Republic. So yes, it is working to a different degree in different countries, but my point is it hasn't been perfected. It hasn't been perfect, and I feel that we are more a threat from misinformation agents than from disinformation agents. Is there anything we can do, or should we just give it up and not do anything? First of all, I do think that it's not like we're not doing anything. I mean, at the beginning of the war, before it started, there was a lot of efforts by civic society and by media, such as Bellingcat and others, to debunk in real time some of the attempts by the Russian government to create a casus belli. Because starting a war with a casus belli that is credible or believable by a large part of even the predisposed society in the rest of the world was going to make support for Ukraine much harder in the early stages of the war. And there were many attempts by Russia to create a casus belli, such as false flag attacks on facilities in Donetsk and so on and so forth. And media and civic organizations were quick to debunk that in real time. So that was a good investment of debunking in real time of every false fact that was being presented. Now, once the war started, it would be a lost cause, and it would be a very inefficient use of time of media and civic organizations to debunk every single statement of the maintenance campaign of disinformation, as I called it earlier. You don't need to do it, because you will then be bogged down in trying to mostly speak to an audience that doesn't believe you, or speak to an audience that already knows that this is not true. So what is a maintenance counter disinformation program? I think it is kind of reminding to the audience that is on your side that they should not fall into the rabbit hole of their own skepticism and their own distrust, because a large part of the population, for good reasons, is skeptical, not only of government, of their own perception of reality. So what you don't want to allow is a long stretch of time when agents of authority, such as Elon Musk, or journalists such as Seymour Hersh, who spread narratives that challenge the mainstream media coverage of what's happening on the front line, to become the dominant, unchallenged narrative. And an example right now is the coverage of what happened on Nord Stream. Seymour Hersh published a completely fabricated story, in my view, and based on my analysis a couple of months ago, essentially saying that it was an American CIA operation that blew up Nord Stream. And this was heavily amplified by a lot of agents of authority in the West who actually trust him, and they don't trust the government, they don't trust the CIA. But the same people are now amplifying the opposite or almost incompatible narrative, which came out in the last couple of days, which is, and it's most likely true, which is that the Americans had nothing to do with this. Actually, the Americans tried to prevent Ukraine from blowing up Nord Stream, and the CIA tried to prevent it from happening. But the same agents of authority are promoting now this narrative. And what debunkers can do is to point to the inconsistency, to the mutual exclusivity of these two narratives, because this would give a comfort to a lot of the skeptical audiences, the sort of critical thinkers, that everything is still the way we thought it was, right? So I think there is a point in measured debunking of large disinformation narratives. For the West, it's difficult to not engage in the hot war, but to engage in an information warfare. Because when you engage in information warfare, you're also making use of tools that are only allowed to a warring party, such as disinformation and propaganda. But Ukraine is at a hot war, and Ukraine is fully legitimately entitled to carry on an information warfare on the enemy, because they were attacked, both hot and with information. And they are doing a very good job. For example, false flag phone calls that I found particularly creative. Mass phone calls to Russians living in the border areas, Rostov and Belgorod and so on and so forth, which pretend to be from the local police, And people are warned to keep their kids off the streets in the evening because there are so many returning former criminals from the Wagner private army that, as we all know, were recruited, many of them were recruited from prisons, that the criminogenic sort of percentage of expected crime is increasing. And this is a very subtle way to increase the awareness of the cost of the war to the Russian population. But it's not something that the West would feel comfortable playing. This game of counter disinformation or counter disinformation with disinformation methods. But for Ukraine, it's a completely legitimate game. And I think they're doing it quite successfully. It is an interplay of civic institutions, of journalists, of particular type of journalists. You start with qualified fact checkers, people that have experience in war investigations, then mainstream media who cover that story, and then governments who have to follow up on that because otherwise the story becomes hard to believe. I haven't been failed by data so far. Data is reliable if you know how to treat it in the traditional sense of journalism by looking for 2 or 3 sources of data. But then if you do that, if you follow that principle, you can trust it much more than 2 or 3 sources, human sources. Human sources are still extremely important because they provide context. They provide an understanding of the motivation. But the discovery of special operation, discovery of the facts of the crime, I would trust data much more than that as a starting point. No, it is an objective risk that prevents me from coming to Russia. There was a time, let me put it this way, I was told that I had a grace period of a year last year because the whole machine was focused on the war and going after journalists was not a priority. But with the start of the second year of the war, apparently Putin had decided that, okay, time to go back to solving the problem with journalists. And this is not a personal statement on my importance, it's a statement also on all of the Russian journalists that live in exile. And unfortunately, in the last 6 months, we've seen at least 3 attempted poisonings of Russian journalists that are still being investigated by Western society. And this is a sign of the new rules of the game, which are Russia has no reputation cost. It's a much worse situation than in Soviet times when there was at least some reputation cost concept by the Soviet Union. Now there's no reputation cost, and there's only a game of whack-a-mole where the Kremlin are trying to suppress any voices that can contribute to domestic dissent. And all bets are off. All journalists are at risk at this point, including foreign journalists. One of the things that I've given up is to discuss with people who do not engage in a rule-based discussion. And whataboutism is one symbol of that, one symptom of that. And the moment I see that somebody's not prepared to have a structured, rule-based conversation, you should bail out of that because you will be wasting your time. If somebody shows a sign that they're willing to engage in a rule-based conversation, such as asking how you know something as opposed to immediately doing an ad hominem attack, then it is worthwhile in engaging, because even if it's not for the benefit of this particular person that you're engaging and spending your time, you are being seen by others as somebody who's willing to engage in a reasonable conversation. So that adds to the credibility. So again, my only recipe is do not waste time with people who are not willing to engage in structured discussion.